be a little bit of microphone passing, so please bear with us. I'm very glad that this book launch is 50 years too late, because at 4 years old, I'm not sure I would have done this justice. I'm very glad I had time to get into my 50s and get to reading age so that I could be here. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here to celebrate this extraordinary new edition of an extraordinary, a landmark volume, Exclusion, Exploitation, Extermination, Race Relations in Colonial Queensland. It's fantastic to have all three authors together here tonight, and special thanks to Kathryn for coming a very, very long way for this. I have the utterly unenviable task of trying to squeeze as much as we can about this thickness of book and the past 50 years into about 20 minutes. So bear with me. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on the unceded lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people, to acknowledge their continuing connection to and custodianship of the country, and also to acknowledge this continent as the home of the world's oldest civilization and longest continuing culture. This country is storied in so many different, long-lived and unique ways. It is extraordinary to work as a storyteller in this place. I'd like to acknowledge elders, past and present, and any First Nations people who are joining us tonight, but also to acknowledge the importance of the stories around the very messy last 200 years that these three people have brought into the light. First of all, in 1975, and it feels like in some ways they're still coming into the light 50 years later. So this was a crucial and game-changing work. It explores the colonial experience of Australia's First Nations people, of Melanesian and Chinese immigrants as well. The pages of endorsements that open the book are phenomenal, not just who they're from, but what they say. That is extraordinary reading in and of itself. And I'm really looking forward to talking with Ray and Kay and Kathryn about it tonight. So I want to start by inviting each of you to talk a little bit about your section of the triptych that forms this book. There's a beautiful description of how you were all discovering these incredible things. I think, Ray, you called it almost daily disclosures, and Kathryn, you said you were just surprised to find so many records of what had been going on. So just to start by going back to the time when you were working in this space, to think about what felt like the most important discoveries or aspects of that work, and also maybe one or two of those moments where you did go, I cannot believe I've just read that. In the interest of democracy, I'm going to go through the three authors the way they appear in the book. So Raymond, first of all to you, it's a vast question, but in the context of colonisation in Australia's First Nations, the most crucial sort of aspect of the work that you felt at the time, and maybe one of those things that you went, I cannot be reading what I'm reading at the moment.
Well, I was just saying to a few people before that it's good we're meeting in this building, because this is where it started for me, just upstairs about over there. I opened my first bundle about Aboriginal white relations in Queensland, and the first records I saw were about the Native Police. And I had, when I was a boy, I had seen a magazine which had an article about the Native Police, and it was a bit of a sensational magazine, and I thought, oh, this couldn't be true. And then I heard nothing about the Native Police after that. 10 years went by. I came in this building and I saw handwritten records about the Native Police. So, you know, it was a shock, and I'm sure the three of us will say every day we were finding things that really shocked us.
Kay, for you, looking at the first Melanesian workers who arrived from sort of 1863, what were the most important discoveries for you, and some of those moments of surprise?
Well, can I say first, I'm very glad there's a big contingent from the Queensland State Archives, because without the archives the three of us would not have had careers, and I owe such a debt to those dedicated archivists who helped me so much and have continued to help me. But the thing is, and also research librarians as well. Now for me, I don't have a degree in history. I have a PhD in history and anthropology, but I haven't done an undergraduate degree. I did my honours degree in anthropology and sociology, and I was going to have to go to Colonial, but I'm an only child, bookish, and I'm a nerd. A well-dressed nerd, but I'm a nerd. Put me out there, I would hate it. And I was very lucky that one of the subjects I wanted to do later, like do sherbet, I was not allowed to do an anthropology. And Raymond said to me, you know, a thing that would be really good would to do the Pacific Islands and the plantation system. And so I could do it because, of course, I'm looking at people from Melanesia coming to Queensland. So I could use my anthropology, and then Raymond very luckily gave me a lot of help using the archives because I had no training, but probably you hadn't either. But I benefited, and I'm always thankful that I could make that transition.
Your turn now, Kathryn. So the first Chinese workers arrived in Queensland on the Nimrod a bit earlier, 1848. What were some of the most important pieces of their story, or some of those kind of jaw-dropping moments that you thought, I can't be seeing this?
Well, it's very hard because there are so many jaw-dropping experiences, but the Chinese, the analysis of the Chinese community is really interesting because they were part of the pastoral areas, and so they first of all suffered the indignities of being effectively bonded labour, and there was a great deal of opposition that they made to the conditions that they were in. So from the very beginning they were very feisty, and once gold was found they were often absconding to try and dig for themselves. So you see with the Chinese a varied pattern really in respect of both their time in the pastoral industry, their time in the gold mining areas, and then additionally when they were working in the urban areas and having to deal with the significant discrimination and hostility from the labour movement amongst other movements. So it covers the whole span of early Queensland life, effectively.
So I have to confess, because the book only found me on Friday, I've been reading it in a kind of curious way. I've actually been reading the 3 sections simultaneously rather than starting at the book and going all the way through. It's an extraordinary book to read, and one of the things that struck me, maybe because of the way I've been coming into it, is the sort of triple whammy of race relations. This is sanctioned, legislated behaviour towards different populations of people, and it feels incredibly important to encounter them in the context of each other. So we tend, I think, to hear about them today much more separately. We hear about what happened to First Nations Australians during colonisation, or we hear about the ASSI population, or we hear about Chinese workforce. But to have them brought together and to understand that this is a colony behaving towards its other people in this way, and quite openly, is, I think, one of the most sort of extraordinary parts of the book. And I wanted to ask you, Kathryn, particularly as someone who's been overseas for a long time, if you see a sort of power still in bringing the 3 pieces together, particularly in the context, there's a lovely line on the back of the book which talks about the importance of overcoming the legacies that this book documents. So just if you see the power of bringing those 3 things together.
I think that is essential, I really do, because there were differences in the way in which the colonial governments responded to the 3 communities, and the way the public was responding to the community. I mean, from my experience of researching both here and in Victoria on the early Chinese communities, I became extremely alert to the issue of immigration law. And of course, all of our current immigration law, every single stone of it is effectively built on the experiments they had as to, first of all, how to stop them coming and make them pay if they do come, but also the relationships that they had, stopping the relationships between Chinese men and native women, and also all of the strictures that came in to stop them having reasonable occupation. So every single occupation the Chinese went into at that time was flooded with restrictions of one sort or another, or levies or containments, and so it was a really concerted plan to effectively make it impossible for them to remain and settle here, and also to bring their families here. So the whole panoply of immigration laws that I now deal with as a lawyer, I remember telling lawyers in the UK when we were writing jointly an immigration law book, you have to start in the 19th century and look at the legal arrangements that were the groundwork for what are the immigration controls of current times.
I think it's one of the things that's really fascinating about Australian history is it's so short. You know, you can sort of turn around and touch it. It's so close. And the way that I came to know Raymond when I was working at Griffith Review was through that bloke called Sir Samuel Griffith, who some of you might know about. And it's one of those moments of understanding that laws that he wrote, which, as you say, you know, they're not that far back, but we're still building on them now. So understanding the closeness of that foundation seems incredibly important. And given the sort of 50-year lifespan of this book, I wanted to explore its legacies a little bit, not just in terms of those endorsements that I mentioned, but Raymond, you spoke about Michael Banton using this work, and I guess we could say it's sort of intersectional work in a really fundamental way, to formulate something called the Queensland model, which was then used to explore race relations in places like South Africa and the US and the UK. Can you talk a little bit about what that model was, and again the importance of bringing the three strands together to provide a lens for other places?
Sure. As you said before, very few books deal with all these groups in one text. And what you've got to try and visualise when you read this book is all these things going on at one and the same time. And it's a bit hard to hold it all in your head. You know, while there's a violent frontier going on, Melanesian people are being oppressed and exploited in the plantation system, and as Kathryn said, the Chinese are having a rough time too throughout the society with the discrimination against them. This is simultaneous. And of course, when Michael Banton read our book, he could see these three fundamental race relations situations, and it's encapsulated really in the title, as I talk about in the new introduction. You know, the Chinese and the Aborigines and the Melanesians all had exploitation. They suffered exclusion, and then the Aboriginal people uniquely suffered from extermination, or we could call it now genocide, as we are increasingly calling it, although Australian historians didn't want to use that, you know, the G word for quite a while. But now we are, more and more of us are starting to see that must be the case. So Michael Banton saw that he could apply these three categories to the story of racial interaction across the world, really. So Queensland sort of provided that model because we had everything going on here at the same time.
Queensland likes to lead the way, but I'm not sure they would have loved having that named after them. There's something in that, though, of these things happening simultaneously, happening in an incredibly short period of time, you know, roughly 50 years-ish, running up to Federation and beyond, obviously. But also, it felt to me there were other aspects at play for the timing of this. There were these extraordinarily potent stereotypes that people had access to, incredible shorthand ways of sort of dismissing each other. There's the sort of beginnings of sociological thinking in Herbert Spencer. There are the ideas of Charles Darwin. There are these two kind of clashing forces of monogenesis and polygenesis, with people, you know, saying, you know, yes, we think everybody is human, or no, actually these people are, this is a whole separate species of people, which is quite shocking. In Queensland too, there's this desperation for social mobility, and all of this runs into capitalism really kind of taking off, like getting into that sort of industrialisation. It feels like a perfect storm, and I wanted to ask you, Kay, if it was particularly speaking, coming from that anthropological and sociological space, if it felt like that to you, these sort of tendrils colliding in a way.
Yes. One of the things I would now develop that I only mention in the book is that after slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1834, there were huge reparations. And you won't be surprised to know that a lot of that reparation money, which is fantastically huge, comes here. Now, Sir John Ewan Davidson, who owned Alexandra Plantation, he had spent $600,000 on his plantation. The budget of the colonial government was $1.2 million. So he was by far the wealthiest person. His family had owned 20,000 slaves in Jamaica, and a lot of the people who came here as plantation owners had money that had come from either Louisiana after the Civil War or from Jamaica. And so that was the basis of it. Now, the other thing I have to say is that the Liberals, who I would call radical Liberals, they were opposed to this system. They saw it as a new system of slavery. 1863, if you read the debates in the Parliament, all the Liberal members of Parliament, who are all urban Liberals, mostly lawyers or journalists, totally oppose this system. But it is run by, the government is run by very wealthy, often investors in the pastoral and then the sugar industry. So Samuel Griffith was not a good premier because he spent his entire premiership trying to ruin the sugar industry, get rid of what he saw as another form of slavery. And in fact, he does destroy the plantation system, which has huge implications because they bring in the small farm system, which worked much better for Melanesian workers because on a farm you know the owner. So we have to see the politics of Queensland also, like they were later, very radical between the Liberals and the more conservative Liberals, as we had later between radical Labor and more conservative. So we can't forget there were many voices in Queensland who opposed not so much the Chinese, because Griffith was a terrible racist about the Chinese. He did try and stop things for the Aborigines, but many people were totally opposed to the plantation system.
I've just got my eye on the time and the knowledge of the two burly historians out the back. So let's stay with the politics. I'm going to jump to 1975, and I did want to mention in particular Melissa Lukashenko's endorsement of the book, which notes that it grew out of what she calls the racist viciousness of that particular time. This is something that Bruce referred to. You know, you're in the midst of the Bjelke-Petersen era here, which was a very strange moment for all of us who didn't grow up in Queensland. And what was about to be the end of the Whitlam era nationally, everything, you know, these are two very distinct ends of a spectrum. Raymond, did the contrast between what was happening at the state level and what had been achieved in those 3 years at a federal level, did that feed into this work as well?
Well, definitely. I think I was thinking about this morning. Actually, we had a sense of rage about the Bjelke-Petersen era, and it was really a continuation of everything, as Bruce said, that was happening as we were studying it. But we were living it as we were studying it, really. And on the other hand, you know, the Whitlam government had come into power in '72, and it was doing a lot of quite radical reformist things. So there was a sense of hope that we had at the time about things. So you had this ebullience with nationally, and you, well, you know, for me, and probably for the three of us, the time of the Bjelke-Petersen government was a time of fear. You didn't know where they were going to go next. They were so extreme, and they were getting more and more extreme as the weeks and months went past. And we were all involved in the anti-apartheid movement, you know, in 1971, and that was very, very brutal indeed. So we were kind of living the history as we were studying the history, researching it, and writing the history.
So I want to finish by bringing us up to the context of now and this political moment. The rejection of the invitation of the Uluru Statement, the disbanding of Queensland's pathway to treaty. I was really interested that Bruce mentioned your work, Kay, in terms of correcting myths as part of what you've done. And I wanted to ask what the most powerful message now for you is in the book that you wrote 50 years ago. What's the one thing that you think still resonates as something important now?
Well, I think we have to remember that there's more people who are enslaved today than there were in the 1860s and 80s. Now, the slavery is not as overt. It is often like what I would call an indentured labour system, which the Melanesians were. They weren't, can I say, they weren't slaves. They were worse than slaves because they were expendable. No capital investment. And so that's where it resonates now. And if you look at here, you have Thai women who come here thinking they're going to work in restaurants, and in fact they're made sex slaves and their passports. Now that happens all over the place. There's rampant slavery in Africa and in the Middle East. And I think what we've got to see is, although the movement against slavery, which was very strong in that evangelical and liberal movement, now it's a very watered down, it's hidden. And by being hidden, it is dangerous. Whereas what we saw in the 19th century, it was very overt. You could see it. There were people seeing it. And I think we have to be very vigilant about groups that all their rights are taken away from them, literally. And if they live or die, it doesn't matter. Because you know what? There's always people that can replace them. And they're conned into, as the Melanesians were conned into, they go into, most of them were not kidnapped, of course. Melanesians aren't stupid. They don't stand on the beach and say, you know, take me away. Young fellows, and most of them, a lot of them are children. They're 16, 17, 18-year-old fellows who think it's going to be an adventure until they get onto the plantation and it's, you know, death from dysentery and typhoid. And so I think we have to be vigilant about what happens now as well.
Kathryn, I wanted to bring the same question to you, particularly given the world that you're working in at the moment. What's the core message that still resonates from this book?
Well, I think there are many messages to it. I do think that we need to understand that that there are very different realities for people living in the same society, and there can be enormous obstacles to the slightest enrichment in their lives. I mean, I do a lot of cases involving victims of trafficking, which ties in with what Kay was just saying. There is a very strong slavery arrangements in the current industrial systems. But I also think that the stereotypes of the 19th century on race are still very strongly embedded in the societies that we live with, so that there are still a very clear hierarchy. I mean, I see it perhaps more hideously in some ways in the UK, but the class system is also a racial typology in the same way that it was in the 19th century. And so I think all of these accounts of how they lived and were dealt with are still indicators of how the machinery works in the current times.
And Raymond, lastly to you, we intersected in the sort of necessary and nuanced space of truth-telling for a little while. What for you is the most powerful part of this story in the context of where we are now?
Well, I also did want to say that this is quite a unique book in that you've got one male and two females all working together to write a history book. And I can't think of any other Australian history book that is like that.
No,
to tell you the truth, that there are edited books that have got chapters by women in them. But the three of us worked as a team. We were a team, and we worked very hard together, and we all put our maximum effort into it. And so, you know, talking about the book today, can you think of any books since that have come out that are like that? Women were starting to produce histories at the time. In 1975, women writers were starting to produce histories of white women like themselves. But these two people were writing histories of people that were different from themselves. They had the empathy to do that work, you know, and we were all in on it, and we worked very, very hard together to produce, I think, something that still holds together. I mean, remember when you read it, it's 50 years old. There's some terminologies in it that maybe we mightn't put there today. But I think our hearts were in the right place. And we actually, you know, held something together there that stood the test of time. And there's no other book like it. There is no other book like it, not just in Queensland, but in the whole of Australia.
Well,
I just wanted to finish up by saying something that occurred to me when I was reading this book. There's an old adage about planting trees, that the best time to plant a tree was 50 years ago and the second best time is today. So please, if you haven't read this book yet, you have had 50 years to do it. I won't give you a hard time, but now is the moment. Thank you all for being here tonight, and would you join me please in thanking Kay Saunders, Kathryn Cronin and Raymond Evans.